Throughout human history, there have been civilizations that left behind more than monuments. They left behind ways of thinking about the world and about what it means to be human. Ancient Egypt is one of them. For more than 3,000 years along the Nile River, Egyptian society took shape, grew, and transformed according to a rhythm unlike any other. In that world, religion, power, knowledge, and everyday life were not separate domains. They flowed together into a single, coherent system of belief. In today's episode, we will explore ancient Egypt through what archaeology, ancient texts, and modern historical research have revealed. Not to mythologize the past, but to observe how an early civilization organized its society, interpreted nature, and searched for meaning in human existence. Everything begins not with a center of power, but with a land that has not yet taken on a shared shape. The Nile Valley appears as an open space where life depends more directly on the rhythm of water than on any human decision. There are no clear boundaries, no leading point to coordinate, and no single voice strong enough to represent all the communities living along the river's course. The only thing that repeats is the rising and retreating of the water, regular in its return, yet impossible to predict, forcing people to adjust every small detail of their lives if they wish to survive. The earliest communities that formed along different stretches of the river did not imagine themselves as part of anything larger. Each group was tied to a piece of land just large enough for farming, hunting, and burying their dead. They organized life according to their own customs, explaining the world through stories that mattered only within their own boundaries. Belief lived close at hand, rooted in the specific features of the surrounding environment, offering comfort against the unease of a natural world that could change without warning. Life placed people in a constant state of defense. The flood season could bring abundance, but it could just as easily wash away everything that had been built. The dry season might open opportunities for cultivation, yet it also pushed communities into direct competition. In such conditions, survival took absolute priority, while the idea of a shared order lay beyond imagination. Each community set its own limits, defined what was acceptable, and defended what it considered essential. Conflict did not need to erupt into open war to exist. It lived in small tensions over who reached the water first, who used the better land, who had the right to pass through a certain area. These boundaries were never written down, but they were upheld through habit, strength, and fragile agreements that could shift at any moment. With no common law to resolve disputes when circumstances changed, every balance remained temporary. The idea of a larger, shared community was largely absent. People identified themselves through family, small groups, or immediate settlements, not through the valley as a whole. Those living along one stretch of the river did not see their fate as tied to those living elsewhere. Exchange might occur, but deep connection did not. Each group existed as a closed unit, accustomed to self-reliance and wary of anything beyond what felt familiar. This fragmentation made life more precarious than it needed to be. When a community faced hardship, there was no shared mechanism for support. When conflicts escalated, there was no authority high enough to end cycles of retaliation. The absence of an overarching framework created not only material instability, but also forced people to expend constant energy on vigilance, living in an environment without a common point of support. And yet, from the repetition of similar problems, a new awareness slowly began to emerge. Floods, droughts, land disputes, and the anxiety of survival were not confined to a single place. They appeared all along the river in different forms, but with the same underlying nature. This realization was not enough to create unity, but it introduced a new thought. Perhaps shared problems required solutions that did not rely solely on individual strength. From here, a question began to take shape. Never spoken aloud, yet increasingly difficult to ignore. If each community remained closed within its own boundaries, could instability ever truly lessen? Was there a way for many groups to coexist within an order wide enough to address recurring fears through shared principles rather than immediate reaction? The question did not bring change right away, but it opened a new direction of thought, one in which people began searching for something the natural world could not provide: stability created by an order of their own making. This instability didn't come from people themselves, but from the very force that sustained them. The Nile carried silt, fish, and the power to renew the land, yet it also carried a degree of uncertainty no community could fully command. The water could rise higher than any calculation, sweeping away fields and homes. It could also retreat too soon, leaving behind hardened ground and efforts that never had time to take shape. Life here was always conditional, and those conditions were not set by human hands. It was precisely this unpredictability that turned stability into a concrete need, no longer a vague desire. When the river shifted its course, land changed hands without warning. A plot that could be farmed today might vanish beneath new layers of silt tomorrow, or become the object of dispute with those across the river. After each flood season, no one could be certain that their place remained the same, and as a result, any lasting sense of security was almost impossible. The earliest clashes were often small, just a few rows of land, a short stretch of irrigation canal. But repeated again and again, they accumulated into prolonged conflict. As resources grew scarce, every group had reason to believe it must defend what was essential to its survival. With no shared principle strong enough to arbitrate disputes, violence and retaliation gradually became familiar solutions. Each episode deepened suspicion and stretched the distance between communities even further. Most of these clashes did not arise from hatred. They grew from a very basic fear, the fear of losing what made continued existence possible. In an environment where a single flood season could overturn every plan, people were compelled to compete to secure their share. Yet the more they did so, the clearer it became that instability did not diminish. It spread, forcing everyone into a constant state of defense, not only against nature, but against neighboring communities as well. From the repetition of the same problems, a new awareness slowly began to take shape. There were certain challenges that no single group could resolve on its own, no matter how strong it was. Regulating the flow of water, redistributing land after floods, preventing one year's harvest from becoming the source of next year's conflict. These tasks lay beyond the capacity of small, isolated communities. Not everyone recognized this at the same time, but shared experience made the idea of a more encompassing order increasingly difficult to avoid. The order imagined at this stage was not abstract. It was tied to very concrete hopes, knowing that the land one cultivated would not be contested every year, trusting that water would be allocated according to a principle rather than seized by whoever arrived first, feeling that when conflict arose, there would be an authority high enough to bring it to an end instead of allowing it to slide into violence. From these simple needs, the desire to live in a world with fewer risks, the earliest seeds of a larger order began to emerge. It had no name, and it was not yet associated with glory or domination. What people sought was simply the ability to sustain stability in a world that was always changing. And when they began to seek that stability together, rather than in isolation, they crossed into a different way of living, one in which power was no longer merely the immediate strength of individual groups, but gradually became the result of recognition, coordination, and agreements repeated long enough to shape a reality larger than any single community. From this shared need for stability, order did not emerge through a clear declaration. There was no recorded beginning, no visible moment when everything shifted into an entirely new state. Life along the Nile continued according to its familiar rhythm, the difference being that relationships between people slowly became less fragmented. Power did not take shape through imposition, but through a gradual settling, formed by many small decisions, repeated long enough to feel natural. At first, there were only short-term agreements. When two communities realized that constant confrontation exhausted them both, they agreed to share water according to temporary arrangements. When one group demonstrated a better understanding of the flood's patterns, others began to rely on that knowledge, not out of respect for status, but because it worked. These connections were never formally named, yet they created subtle dependencies, difficult to notice at first and gradually accepted as normal. At the same time, alliances formed around immediate interests. A stronger group offered protection to a weaker one against external threats, in exchange for support or tribute. These arrangements were unstable and could shift as the balance of power changed. Still, the repetition of such short-lived alliances accustomed people to the idea that power could extend beyond the limits of a single community, even if it had not yet taken on a stable form. Conflict did not disappear, but the way it was handled began to change. Certain individuals were sought out to mediate, to organize, to bring multiple groups together in specific situations. They held no fixed titles, and their influence depended entirely on acceptance. One day they were listened to, the next they might be ignored. Power existed here as a temporary condition, something that had to be continually sustained, or it would quickly dissolve. What is striking is that no one believed they were building a state. What they were doing was simply responding to concrete problems: land disputes, the sharing of water, the protection of harvests. Yet, as these problems returned, the responses to them were repeated as well. Over time, spontaneous reactions turned into habits, and habits began to form a structure that could be anticipated. Power accumulated in this way, not through a proclaimed collective will, but through fatigue with disorder. When people realized that following a shared arrangement, even an imperfect one, was more bearable than constant confrontation, they accepted giving up a portion of their autonomy in exchange for greater stability. This concession did not happen once, it was repeated often enough to become instinctive. Even so, this power remained fragile. It rested on consensus rather than coercion, on acceptance rather than force. A single unusual flood, a major conflict, or the emergence of a stronger force could cause newly formed arrangements to collapse. Yet even when they did, people did not return to the original starting point. They had learned that compromise was possible, that alliances could endure, and that a shared power, even a fragile one, was worth having. Because of this, the process of formation was never entirely erased after each breakdown. Every time an old arrangement failed, people began again with a deeper understanding. And as power grew accustomed to being recognized, a new question became clearer. It was no longer whether a shared order should exist, but who could stand as its representative, and how power might come to be felt as something natural in everyday life, rather than a temporary agreement always on the verge of disappearance. As local arrangements became familiar, the scope of human awareness gradually expanded. Two regions that had once existed like parallel worlds no longer lay beyond each other's sight. Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt were no longer distant ends of the river, but were increasingly understood as different parts of the same living space, subject to the same pressures. This coming closer did not unfold through a dramatic event, but through small frictions and repeated encounters where curiosity was always accompanied by caution. For a long time, each region had reason to believe it could stand on its own. Different natural conditions shaped different rhythms of life, and different ways of organizing communities followed. Yet it was precisely these differences placed side by side that revealed a shared limitation. Neither side truly controlled the uncertainty of nature, and neither possessed enough resources to resolve every instability on its own. Problems that seemed distinct turned out to rest on the same foundation: a persistent concern for safety and the ability to sustain a stable way of life. Drawing closer did not take the form of outright conquest. It resembled a prolonged process of negotiation in which each side was forced to adjust in order to avoid repeating tensions that had grown all too familiar. At times, violence surfaced as an old reflex. At other moments, there were pauses long enough for people to recognize that constant confrontation only drained what they were struggling to preserve. From that realization, compromise ceased to be seen as weakness and came instead to be understood as a way to reduce risk. A new framework slowly took shape, not to erase differences but to contain them within a broader scope. The two regions did not become the same, but they accepted coexistence under shared principles. Symbols, rituals, and forms of organization were adjusted so that they would not feel entirely foreign to either side. The aim at this stage was not to create grand pride, but simply to make daily life less strained than before. From this, a center of power began to emerge more clearly. It was not yet strong enough to impose itself, and it still depended heavily on acceptance from local communities. This center functioned as a point of reference, a place to which regions turned when problems exceeded their ability to manage alone. Its presence was still new, often questioned, and sometimes challenged, yet it differed from earlier short-term arrangements in one crucial way. It suggested endurance, hinting at a shared framework that extended beyond a single flood season or a single generation. Seen from a distance, this unification might easily be mistaken for the result of superior force. But for those living within it, it felt more like a quiet decision, an acceptance born of exhaustion with disorder, expressed not through declarations, but through the way people began to behave each day. They lived as if a shared order was self-evident, even as they retained the distinct traits of their respective regions. It was this shift in daily life that produced a deeper transformation. For the first time, the idea of "we" extended beyond the familiar boundaries of village and locality. It remained fragile and easily unsettled, yet it was enough to change how power was perceived. No longer simply a matter of who was stronger, power came to be measured by who could keep this shared framework functioning. From here, attention gradually turned away from mere coexistence toward new questions. Who would represent this expanding order, and how power might be experienced as a familiar presence in everyday life, rather than as a force one had to confront anew each day? The shared framework had become clear enough for people to accept living within it, and from that acceptance arose the need for a concrete point of convergence. Not to impose authority, but to give the framework a visible form, something with a place, a presence, and someone willing to carry its weight. From this need, the role of the pharaoh gradually took shape, not as a king in the usual sense, but as a position granted by society to an individual where power rested less in command than in the ability to represent the balance upon which all of life depended. The pharaoh was not seen as the creator of order, but as the one who kept that order from drifting off course. This kind of power did not require constant intervention. It existed in the sense that the world was functioning as it should, that the relationship between people, nature, and forces beyond human control remained within acceptable bounds. When the flood arrived at the right time, when the rhythm of life remained undisturbed, that role was reinforced without the need for long explanations. What made this power distinctive was that it was not separated from everyday life. It was felt through rituals, symbols, and the way society organized time and space. People were not asked to believe blindly, they believed because they were living within the tangible results of that order. When work continued without disruption, when conflict stayed within manageable limits, power was present as a natural part of the world, much like the flow of water or the light of the sun. The distance between the pharaoh and the people existed in a very particular way. The pharaoh was not like them, yet not entirely apart from them. Every daily activity was placed in an indirect relationship with this central role. Those who sowed seeds, those who built, those who kept records, all understood that their work served not only their families or small communities, but also helped sustain the shared order itself. Power, therefore, did not reside only at the summit, it spread downward into ordinary actions. Because of this diffusion, power did not need to appear everywhere. It was sustained through symbols, through repeated rituals, through the way society grew accustomed to arranging its life around a common rhythm. Obedience was no longer felt as coercion, but as part of a way of living that had become familiar. People followed not only out of fear of consequences, but because this order offered a greater sense of security than the fragmentation that came before. Yet power built on perception always requires care. It survives through stability and through the feeling that the order it represents is still fulfilling its role. If prolonged imbalances were to appear, trust could weaken quickly. At this moment, however, the role of the pharaoh was still strong enough to hold the new structure in place, not through force, but through widespread recognition that the world was still being kept within limits people could accept. And once power had been accepted in this way, society's focus began to shift. Attention moved away from the question of who held power toward how this order was actually maintained in everyday life. The quiet structures behind the scenes, often unnoticed, yet decisive in practice, gradually became central. It was there that power was transformed into organization, into habit, and into a durability capable of lasting far beyond any single moment or individual. Power sank so deeply into everyday life that it no longer needed to assert itself through constant pressure. Sacred authority and tradition gradually took over the role once played by violence, quietly, yet far more effectively. People were no longer forced to submit each day because they had grown accustomed to seeing the existing system as reasonable, even as the only thing capable of preserving the balance on which their lives depended. This belief was not created by a grand declaration. It formed through the steady repetition of daily life. Rituals unfolded at the right moments, stories were passed down in familiar patterns, symbols appeared in places people had long learned to expect. When these elements remained unchanged, they began to feel like an inherent part of the world. And when order was experienced as something natural, obedience no longer felt imposed. It felt like moving in step with a rhythm long taken for granted. Tradition played a uniquely binding role. It did not require explanation or justification. Its strength lay in familiarity and repetition. Someone raised within the same rituals, the same arrangements of time and space, would struggle to imagine that the world could function any other way. Compliance, therefore, did not arise from fear of punishment, but from the reassurance that came with living in a world whose order felt clear and reliable. Sacred authority carried power beyond the realm of ordinary dispute. When order was linked to the divine, resisting it was no longer seen simply as disobedience, but as a disruption of the balance that kept the world stable. This did not need to be stated aloud. It slowly permeated how people understood right and wrong, order and chaos. Governance, in this context, was not a sequence of commands, but the maintenance of a shared story that most of society had already learned to accept. Obedience formed in this way created a kind of power that was difficult to see. Society functioned smoothly without the need for constant, forceful intervention. People followed because they believed that the order brought tangible benefits, making life less risky than before. Power, when supported by belief, became light in its outward expression, yet deep in its influence. But this very lightness also concealed a weakness. Belief survives only as long as life continues to reflect what it promises, If tradition no longer makes people feel secure, if sacred order no longer appears in everyday reality, obedience can quickly turn into doubt. At this moment, belief still holds society together in quiet stability. Yet for that silence not to depend entirely on perception, power begins to require more concrete structures. People working each day behind the symbols, quietly turning belief into organization and order into a system capable of sustaining itself continuously in lived reality. Once symbols reached a point where they no longer needed to appear constantly, power shifted into a different space, quieter, more discreet, and far more durable. In this space, the system no longer relied on ritual or imagery, but on the daily, repetitive work of people whose names were rarely spoken. Officials, scribes, land surveyors, and granary keepers formed a continuous network of activity where everything was recorded, organized, and adjusted so that life would not slide back into chaos. These people did not represent supreme authority, yet they made authority effective. They knew which land belonged to whom after each flood season, how much grain could be distributed, which families had fulfilled their obligations. Their power lay in highly specific knowledge, bound to numbers, symbols, and carefully preserved records. Through this, order did not exist only as belief, but became a system that could be repeated independent of any single individual's will. In this context, taxation carried a clear practical meaning. It was not simply an act of taking, but a way for society to gather resources in order to protect itself against unpredictable change. Grain was collected to sustain the administrative apparatus, to build reserves for harsh times, to ensure that when nature ceased to be favorable, society could still endure. People might not see the entire process, but they recognized its result when life did not collapse after each major disruption. Scribes held a crucial role within this structure. They did not determine order, but they gave order memory. Once things were written down, society no longer depended entirely on oral accounts or individual recollection. Duties, rights, and distributions were fixed in text, reducing arbitrariness and creating the sense that life was being guided by stable principles. Record keeping did not make power greater, but it made it last longer. This apparatus drew little attention. It produced no striking images and required no celebration. Precisely because of this, it could endure. Social stability did not come from rare, dramatic displays, but from the consistent handling of very small matters. When land was allocated fairly, when food supplies were calculated accurately, when obligations were clearly recorded, many conflicts were resolved before they had a chance to spread. People tend to remember monumental buildings and sacred rituals, but rarely think of inventories, figures, or granaries hidden from view. Yet it is these unseen elements that form the true foundation of order. If belief allows people to accept the way society is organized, this quiet machinery allows society to keep functioning without needing to reaffirm that belief every day. And as organization becomes familiar, everyday life takes on a different shape, one in which order is no longer a distant idea, but something present in meals, in work, and in the steady rhythm of each person's daily life. Once the system had operated smoothly for long enough, shared rules no longer needed to be spoken aloud. They drifted out of texts and commands and settled into habit, into the rhythms of everyday life. People followed them not because someone stood there demanding compliance, but because this had become the way they lived. No laws were publicly recited for memorization, yet everyone understood where the boundaries lay, what was acceptable, and which actions would bring trouble if crossed. These rules lived in concrete practice: the timing of planting, the division of irrigation channels, the order of work and rest. All were repeated often enough to feel self-evident. People did not call this law, yet they adjusted their behavior to these patterns without conscious thought. Living differently was not impossible, but it created a sense of being out of step, a discomfort most preferred to avoid. Rituals played a crucial role in linking order to emotion. They marked time, created beginnings and endings, and reminded people that life had structure and sequence. When rituals took place at the right moment and in the right way, they reinforced the feeling that everything remained within controllable limits. Order was therefore not only understood intellectually, but felt through familiarity and reassurance. A shared rhythm of life, shaped by nature and refined by society, became the foundation for coordination. The Nile rose and fell in cycles regular enough for people to rely on, and it was this regularity that allowed common expectations to form. When many people waited for the same event and prepared for it together, coordination emerged without the need for direct instruction. Unwritten law was powerful precisely because it did not need to impose itself. It appeared in the look exchanged when someone acted differently, in the heavy silence when a ritual was skipped, in the unease felt when a familiar rhythm was disrupted. People adjusted themselves not only out of fear of consequences, but because they did not want to be the ones who disturbed the harmony their community depended on. This kind of order allowed society to function smoothly without constant intervention from a central authority. Power was present everywhere, yet nowhere obvious, because it had dispersed into the habits of individuals. Each person, simply by living in step with the shared rhythm, helped keep the broader structure from fracturing. Yet the durability of these invisible rules also carried a clear limit. When circumstances changed faster than familiar rhythms, when new needs emerged that no longer fit old patterns, order continued to function but began to produce friction. At this stage, everything still held together through silent consensus. But precisely because order was so deeply embedded in habit, society was slow to notice that the central question had begun to shift. No longer whether order existed, but what that order was actually giving to the people living within it each day. Shared rules had settled fully into habit, most clearly visible in the lives of those directly bound to the land. A farmer's day began very early, when the light was still thin and the ground retained the night's cool. They rose without being called, because the rhythm of life had settled into their bodies. Along the Nile, time was not measured in hours, but in light and water levels, in the quiet certainty that failing to reach the fields at the right moment meant losing a part of the day for nothing. Breakfast was simple: bread made from barley or wheat, sometimes onions, dates, or dried fish. Not much, but enough to continue working. Food was not meant for pleasure, but to keep the body going. Farmers understood their limits well. If exhaustion came too early, work would be left unfinished, and the consequences would reach beyond a single, unproductive day, stretching into longer periods of hardship. Work unfolded according to the rhythm nature allowed. When the water was high, they waited. When it receded, they plowed. Once seeds were in the ground, they watched the sky and the river, hoping the year would unfold no differently from the ones before. Movements were repeated so often that little thought was required, yet nothing was careless. A small mistake could change the outcome, and farmers lived with this quiet attentiveness every day. Rest was as simple as food: a house made of mud brick, cool during the day and warm at night, enough to shelter from sun, wind, and animals. Sleep came quickly after long hours of labor, not because there was complete peace of mind, but because the body no longer had strength for worry. Even so, concern remained: floods rising too high, waters retreating too early, pests, heavy taxes, and the possibility that a year's work might still not be enough to feed a family. Alongside worry lived a steady hope. Hope that this season would not be worse than the last. Hope that the granaries would hold through harsh times. Hope that children would grow strong and continue the familiar work, because familiarity meant safety. Farmers did not seek great change. What they needed was continuity, that tomorrow would not differ too sharply from today. The empire was felt not through grand symbols, but through very concrete things. Taxes were collected on time and did not exceed what could be endured. Granaries opened when shortages came. There was a sense that despite hardship, life rested on an order that could be relied upon. When that order functioned smoothly, farmers rarely thought about power or rule. They simply knew that life was continuing in a way they could live with. It was this steadiness that upheld the entire society. Without proclamation or display, order entered the lives of the most ordinary people. One day passed much like the one before, and that repetition formed a durable foundation. From this foundation, other layers of society gradually became more visible, each with its own rhythm and concerns, revealing that society was sustained not only by fields and farmers, but also by hands working elsewhere, hands engaged in different forms of labor, yet still bound to the same shared order. The rhythm shaped by the fields did not belong only to those who worked the land. It spread through the whole of society, reaching even those who never held a plough. In other spaces, artisans, soldiers, and tomb builders lived very different lives, yet they were still bound by the same shared order. None of them saw themselves as the center of anything grand. Their concern was simply to complete the work of the day, well enough that tomorrow would not become harder than it needed to be. Artisans spent most of their lives in small workshops, their hands familiar with clay, wood, stone, or metal. They did not work to experiment or to express themselves. They worked to meet needs that were already clearly defined. A jar to store grain, a plough blade strong enough to last, an object for ritual. Everything was made according to patterns long established. Repetition did not make them feel trapped, because each finished piece confirmed that they still had a place within the order that was functioning around them. Soldiers lived differently, but their lives were less dramatic than outsiders often imagine. Most of their time passed in waiting for orders, waiting for news, waiting for events that might never come. Their task was to be present, a quiet reminder that order could defend itself when necessary. They trained, patrolled, and followed discipline not for glory, but because it was the only way to survive in a role that always carried risk. Tomb builders inhabited a world apart. Each day they worked in the presence of death, yet this did not weigh on them as darkness. For them, death was not an ending, but a place already arranged within the larger order. Building resting places for others was also a way of affirming that life did not end without meaning. They did not believe they were creating something eternal. They simply did their work well in exchange for security for their families and for themselves. What these people shared was a refusal to place themselves at the center of the story. They did not expect to be remembered. Their work was tied to food, to safety, to keeping life from slipping into disorder. It was this ordinariness that allowed society to continue. What later came to be called history was, in truth, shaped by countless small choices repeated day after day by people who never intended to leave a mark. They lived within the order without needing to understand its full structure. Artisans knew their products would be used. Soldiers knew their presence mattered, even if it was rarely acknowledged. Tomb builders knew their work was bound to the deepest beliefs of their society. Each person saw only a narrow fragment of the whole, yet it was precisely these fragments that fitted together to form a stable entirety. From a distance, such work might be described as the foundation of a civilization. But for those living within that order, it was simply everyday life, filled with very concrete concerns. And perhaps it was precisely because they focused on living each day fully, without trying to create anything grand, that the order endured long enough for society to reach a high degree of stability, a point at which power no longer needed to assert itself constantly, and silence itself became a sign of strength. Life unfolded within a stable framework, and the sacred world did not stand apart as a distant, elevated realm. The gods were present at close range, so close that the boundary between everyday life and the sacred became difficult to draw. People did not need to step away from their work or familiar spaces to encounter the divine, because that presence revealed itself in the water flowing through the fields, in the morning light, in the steady cycles of growth and decay unfolding all around them. Religion, therefore, did not exist as an abstract system of belief. It was a way of interpreting what people directly experienced. When the water rose at the right time, it signaled balance. When harvests failed, it suggested that order had been disturbed. The gods did not simply grant favors or deliver punishment. They reflected the condition of the world itself, as if they lived within the same rhythms and were affected by them as well. Every living space, every occupation carried its own connection to the sacred. Farmers hoped for regular floods. Artisans hoped their hands would not falter. Soldiers sought protection against risks they could not foresee. Prayers did not have to be elaborate. They were often brief, sometimes no more than a familiar gesture repeated each day. It was this repetition that made belief more durable than any spoken vow. Rituals were woven into labor, not to pull people away from reality, but to give that reality meaning. When a ritual was performed, it did not point only toward the unseen world, but also toward the community taking part. People stood together in the same space, sharing the sense that they were living within an order they could rely on. Belief in this way became a bond that required no explanation. What is striking is that the gods were not imagined as perfectly flawless beings. They carried traits close to human life, at times generous, at times severe, at times unpredictable. This closeness prevented people from feeling entirely powerless. They could pray, negotiate, or seek harmony with the unseen world through concrete actions in everyday life. Religion, then, did more than help people understand the world, it helped them accept it. When faced with forces beyond their control, belief offered the sense that events still belonged to some form of order, even if that order was not always clear. This feeling did not erase fear, but it made fear bearable by placing it within a framework larger than any single individual. It was precisely this ordinariness that allowed religion to sink deeply into society without coercion. People lived alongside the gods as they lived alongside nature, not always consciously aware of their presence, yet always accounting for it in how they acted. And once belief had blended into life in this way, it shaped not only the relationship between people and the unseen world, but also how they understood life's end, where death was not seen as an absolute conclusion, but as a continuation that required careful preparation within the same order that had encompassed life itself. Death, understood in this way, did not stand in opposition to life, but existed within the very structure of society itself. People did not see death as an absolute barrier, but as a movement into another space, where familiar principles continued to operate. This understanding did not sit at the margins of spiritual life. It lay at the center of how society organized itself, shaping directly how people worked, behaved, and judged their own worth. The afterlife was not imagined as vague or abstract. It had a clear form with trials, with fairness, and with an endpoint. People believed that what they had done in life did not vanish with the body, but was carried forward to face further judgment. Death, therefore, did not erase moral order. It extended it into another plane, one in which no one could escape the consequences of the choices they had made. This belief gave present life a particular weight. Every action was tied not only to immediate benefit, but also to what was believed to lie ahead. Living with restraint, following shared conventions, maintaining balance in relationships with others, were not practiced merely to avoid trouble in this life, but to prepare for a continuation thought to be unavoidable. Death was accounted for early on, not as a threat, but as a certainty that required careful preparation. For this reason, society devoted substantial resources to what followed the end of a human life. Burial, preservation of the body, and the preparation of goods were not seen as wasteful. They were ways of maintaining order beyond the limits of visible existence. A tomb was not simply a place for a body, but a carefully arranged space meant to ensure that the deceased could continue to exist within another order. What was built for death directly reflected how society understood and valued life. Belief in final judgment associated with the figure of Osiris meant that justice was not confined to the present world. It became a principle believed to be indestructible. This did not make injustice disappear, but it offered a framework that helped people endure what they could not change. When order in this life proved imperfect, hope was placed in balance elsewhere, in a realm where everything would be seen more completely. This understanding kept the dead from being cut off from the community. They retained a place in ritual, in remembrance, in the way families and society continued to speak of them. The boundary between the two worlds was felt as thin, clear enough to distinguish yet not strong enough to sever connection. This sense of continuity softened the fear of complete disappearance, a fear that quietly shapes how people understand their own existence. Death, seen as a transition, did not diminish the value of life, but placed it within a wider frame. Life became an essential period of preparation, in which each person sought to live in accordance with principles believed to extend beyond the limits of a single lifetime. Society as a whole was organized around this deep conviction, achieving a rare degree of stability. Power did not need to reveal itself through upheaval or display. It showed itself most clearly in prolonged regularity, in a world that functioned so smoothly it no longer needed to prove its own strength. This stability lasted long enough that society no longer felt the need to constantly re-examine itself. Everything continued along familiar paths, and power no longer needed to appear through display. In this state, strength did not lie in attention-grabbing acts, but in the durable rhythm of ordinary life, where no disruption was large enough to force people to question the foundations supporting them. Life moved on according to an accepted rhythm. The water rose and receded, fields were planted at the proper time, rituals followed their familiar calendar. There was no pressure to expand outward or to prove anything to the world beyond. Society did not need to convince itself that its order was legitimate, because that legitimacy was confirmed each day by the simple fact that the system kept working without requiring major adjustment. This quiet continuity revealed a level of stability that many societies never reach. Prosperity in this period did not take the form of sudden bursts. It was not measured by constant confrontation or ambitious proclamations. It showed itself in the ability to sustain a shared framework across generations where people were born, grew up, worked, and died within the same order without feeling crushed by it. This deep sense of security allowed society to focus on refining what already existed rather than endlessly reacting to instability. In such conditions, central authority did not need to intervene deeply in everyday life. The administrative machinery functioned reliably, rules had become instinctive, and belief continued to do its work without needing to be restated. Most people never considered the possibility that order might collapse simply because they had never seen it happen. The prolonged experience of stability created the sense that the world had found its most suitable shape. It was precisely in this unpressured environment that many important achievements took form, not because society needed to assert itself, but because it had the time and resources to refine. When the struggle for survival no longer dominated every aspect of life, people could think more carefully, work with greater care, and improve existing structures instead of hurriedly constructing new ones in response to fear. This quiet flourishing is easy to overlook in hindsight because it is not marked by dramatic events, yet it is the necessary condition for every more visible achievement. A society can build monumental structures, develop organizational thought, and cultivate culture only when everyday life is stable enough for people to believe that long-term efforts will not be swept away by sudden upheaval. Still, prolonged stability carries a subtle paradox. When everything functions smoothly, the need for self-examination and adjustment gradually fades. Order becomes trusted to the point where it is rarely questioned. And it is precisely within this deep confidence that monumental works begin to appear. At once, expressions of strength and signs that society is reaching its highest point, where it is no longer focused solely on maintaining the present, but begins to seek ways to leave a mark that extends beyond immediate life itself. A framework that endures long enough gradually loses the trace of its own formation. It is no longer seen as the result of past choices, but as the natural state of the world itself. People are born into it, grow within it, and leave it without ever needing to place it alongside any alternative. The idea that things might once have been otherwise becomes distant, even unnecessary to consider. This confidence does not need to be declared. It appears in the way rituals are performed without further explanation, in the way the administrative system continues to operate as if it never had a beginning, in the quiet belief that this familiar rhythm of life will continue long after those living within it are gone. Order is no longer something to be defended day by day, but an obvious foundation upon which everything else rests. When people believe they are living in a stable world, the way they build begins to change. They no longer think within the limits of a single lifetime. Structures are imagined to withstand time, rituals are standardized to repeat without adjustment, systems of governance are passed down as practices already proven. Flexibility is no longer the highest value, endurance is. And it is this endurance that feeds the belief that the order itself need not fear disappearance. In such circumstances, the empire feels no pressure to expand constantly in order to affirm its position. Its strength lies in depth, in its ability to sustain internal stability rather than in seeking challenges beyond its borders. Roles appear settled, rulers continue to rule, laborers continue to labor, rituals occur at the proper times, and nature, for the most part, follows the familiar patterns the society has learned to rely on. This widespread sense of security allows people to live without frequent self-questioning. When order is believed to endure far into the future, anxiety about what lies ahead diminishes. Rather than preparing for profound change, society turns its attention to refining details, making what already exists more complete. Effort is directed toward reinforcement, not reconstruction. At the same time, the way time itself is understood begins to shift. The past becomes a template, the present a continuation, and the future is imagined as an extension of what is already familiar. When a society believes it will last indefinitely, it rarely considers the need for fundamental adaptation. Change, if it occurs at all, is seen as minor adjustment, not something capable of touching the foundations. At this moment, confidence remains a genuine source of strength. It holds society together and gives people the sense that they belong to an order larger than themselves. Yet within this very security, a new impulse quietly begins to form, unnamed but persistent. When order has become durable enough to escape doubt, people begin to wish to inscribe that durability into material form, into structures meant to outlast individual lives, as a way of affirming that this order is not only real, but worthy of being placed into time in a manner that cannot easily be erased. The structures that rise from the ground first command attention by their sheer scale, yet when observed more closely, the pyramids speak far more about the society that created them than about the individual who lies within. They were not born from impulse or momentary display, but from a coherent understanding of how the world was ordered, one in which labor, organization, and belief were tightly bound together. The pyramids are the outcome of a society stable enough to think far ahead, confident enough to mobilize immense resources, and consistent enough to pursue a single purpose over a very long span of time. To build structures such as the pyramids of Giza, stone and human strength alone were not sufficient. What proved decisive was the capacity for organization. Tens of thousands of people had to be mobilized, sustained, and coordinated over many years. Each block set in its precise place was the result of a carefully arranged sequence: quarrying, transport, division of labor, and the constant provision of food. A structure of this kind could not emerge from a society governed by chance. Labor here was neither chaotic nor blindly coerced. Most of those who took part did not believe they were doing anything extraordinary. They were simply carrying out the task that belonged to them within a familiar order. The work was heavy, but it followed a rhythm, had a clear purpose, and was placed within a meaning that extended beyond the individual. Contributing to a shared construction created the sense that every effort, however small, was bound to a whole that mattered. The pyramids also reflect a deep belief in continuity. No society would commit such vast resources to structures associated with death if death were understood as an absolute end. Their construction reveals a conviction that the existing order was not confined to visible life alone, but extended into another realm. These monuments were not built only for the dead, they also reinforced the living belief that the world they belonged to possessed structure, purpose, and the ability to endure through time. What is striking is that the pyramids do not need to explain themselves. Their presence alone generates meaning. They stand in silence, impossible to ignore, as evidence that this order could align people, resources, and belief toward a single direction for an extraordinarily long time. Without any declaration, their enduring form became a message about the sustaining power of the society that created them. Yet, like all great symbols, the pyramids carry an inner paradox. They express the profound confidence of an order so stable that it could invest in what lay beyond everyday necessity. At the same time, they quietly raise a question. When a society is capable of creating structures that seem nearly unchanging, does it remain sensitive enough to notice the subtle shifts taking place within its own foundations? That question does not demand an immediate answer. It lingers beneath the shadow of the massive stones as the empire continues to operate in the belief that its order will stand for a very long time, long after the people who built it are no longer present. With no further need to prove itself through displays of strength, the most enduring achievements began to take shape in silence. They were not meant to impress, but to make life less dependent on chance. Writing, architecture, and systems of social administration emerged from this need as tools that allowed the rhythm of life to be maintained and repeated without forcing each generation to begin again from the starting point. Writing first appeared as a means of memory. Who had delivered how much grain, which storehouses still held reserves, which rituals needed to be performed, and when? These details had to be preserved so that order would not rest entirely on individual recollection. Once information was written down, it escaped the limits of a single lifetime. Society could maintain continuity without depending on who was still alive to remember, or what knowledge died with those who passed away. Writing thus became a foundation of stability rather than a tool for displaying learning. Architecture carried the same spirit. Beyond symbolic monuments, most spaces were built to serve everyday life. Homes, granaries, temples, and communal structures followed familiar principles that made them easy to use and easy to adapt to. Architecture did not seek to surprise, but to fit its environment and its rhythm of life. That familiarity created a sense of safety, the feeling that the surrounding world had been arranged according to an order that could be anticipated. Social administration was where these achievements proved most effective. Organization did not rely on momentary decisions, but on procedures tested over time. Tax collection, food distribution, and labor coordination followed stable patterns. When administration functioned smoothly, it was barely noticed. People became aware of it only when order was disrupted. These achievements did not stand apart from one another. Writing supported administration. Administration shaped the organization of space, and space directly influenced how people lived and practiced ritual. Together they formed a self-reinforcing cycle in which each element made the others more effective. None was designed to exist independently because all were oriented towards sustaining the shared functioning of society. Because they arose from very concrete needs, these achievements did not carry an air of display. They did not need to astonish in order to prove their value. Their value lay in the fact that people could rely on them every day without much thought. When writing recorded accurately, when space was used as intended, when administration kept society stable, order continued quietly. Yet that very quiet concealed a vulnerability. When tools that serve daily life become too familiar, people can forget that they were created to solve specific problems under specific conditions. If circumstances change while these patterns remain unadjusted, they can gradually lose their relevance. At this moment, everything is still functioning effectively. But it is precisely this long-standing effectiveness that leads society to believe it has found an optimal way of organizing itself. While unseen pressures begin to accumulate, preparing for the moment when order no longer feels effortless, and signs of fatigue emerge from within the machinery once regarded as unshakable. A system that operates for long enough does more than preserve stability, it gradually begins to carry the weight of itself. Structures created to serve life slowly turn back and require life to sustain them. Taxes increase not necessarily because society has grown wealthier, but because the machinery now demands more resources to maintain layers of operation that have become increasingly complex. Each new administrative layer once had a clear purpose, but over time these layers accumulate, widening the distance between the center and everyday life to a point that becomes very difficult to reverse. In this context, taxation is no longer felt simply as a contribution to shared stability. It gradually becomes a burden. Farmers continue to work according to the familiar rhythm of the Nile, still planting and waiting for the harvest, yet the portion they retain for their families steadily shrinks. This change unfolds slowly enough that each instance can be explained away with a specific reason. But when such reasons repeat, a sense of unease begins to seep into daily life. Bureaucracy, once a source of reliability, grows increasingly distant from the people it was created to serve. Administrators and record keepers work with figures, reports, and directives passed through multiple layers of mediation. In that process, the concrete realities of labor are easily blurred. Decisions no longer arise from direct contact, but from numbers that have already been simplified and rearranged. This distance rarely produces immediate reaction. Most of the time it generates fatigue. People continue to comply, but no longer because they believe the order is protecting them. They comply because they are accustomed to it, because not complying seems even riskier. Obedience remains, but it is no longer light. It becomes a habit without warmth, detached from any sense of reassurance. The most dangerous aspect of a heavy system does not lie in visible coercion, but in its slowness to respond to small changes. When nature shifts, when local economies struggle, the response from the center is no longer timely. Procedures that once produced stability now prolong problems because they were designed for a world that no longer exists in the same form. Even so, at this stage, order has not yet collapsed. Harvests still arrive, rituals are still performed, symbols are still present. It is precisely this continuation that allows signs of instability to be overlooked. Society has grown accustomed to believing that the system has endured many trials before, and that this time will be no different. But fatigue does not disappear when ignored. It accumulates in each heavier tax burden, each decision detached from lived reality, each growing sense that order is demanding more than it gives in return. At this point, the empire still stands in form, but its inner foundation has shifted. Order is no longer felt as a natural support, but as a structure to be endured. And as this feeling spreads, the central question is no longer whether the machinery can continue to function, but whether it remains flexible enough to adjust before the distance between center and local life becomes not merely a problem of administration, but a clear sign of an order slowly losing its internal cohesion. When the machinery carries too much weight, distance is no longer measured by maps, but by lived experience. The center still exists, still issues decisions, still maintains the signs of authority. Yet for distant communities, the shared system becomes increasingly difficult to reach. Its presence is no longer felt through timely support or concrete understanding, but through delayed demands, regulations poorly aligned with local realities, and obligations that steadily exceed what people can endure. In the provinces, life continues according to familiar rhythms. People still plant their fields, still wait for the waters to rise, still face the same enduring risks. But they begin to realize that decisions shaping their daily lives are made far away by people who rarely see the fields, the granaries, or the specific hardships they face. The center knows the local world through reports, figures, and summaries, and in that process, crucial details are flattened or lost. Trust does not disappear all at once. It thins gradually in ways that are difficult to detect year by year. Each new demand unaccompanied by corresponding support, each hardship met with delayed or absent response, weakens another thread of connection. People continue to comply, but that compliance is no longer tied to a sense of belonging to a shared order. It becomes a habit maintained in the absence of clear alternatives. This growing distance reshapes how communities view the order itself. Rather than seeing it as protection against chaos, they begin to experience it as something foreign, at times a burden. The stories that once reinforced a sense of fairness and balance no longer clearly reflect everyday reality. The gap between narrative and experience drains the order of the moral weight that once sustained it. From the perspective of the center, this shift is difficult to perceive. The machinery still runs, rituals are still performed, symbols still stand. From within, there appears to be no immediate sign of collapse. But in the provinces, the sense of connection has changed. People increasingly rely on smaller communities, on close and familiar relationships, rather than on a shared structure in which they no longer feel heard. The danger of this fracture lies in its quietness. It does not produce immediate upheaval. There is no large rebellion, no sudden disintegration. There is only the silent withdrawal of trust. Order continues to exist in name, but its inner substance grows thin. People go on living within the empire, yet the feeling of belonging steadily fades. As trust weakens, power is forced to rely more heavily on procedure and coercion to maintain what was once held together by natural acceptance. This shift happens slowly, but its consequences are clear. The shared system is no longer sustained primarily by consensus, but by the inertia of its own machinery. That inertia is strong enough to prolong existence for a time, but rigid enough to allow fractures to spread as fatigue quietly accumulates in every corner of social life. There are moments when form remains intact, but substance has quietly departed. The empire still appears on maps, rituals are still carried out on schedule, symbols still stand in their familiar places, yet the sense of connection that once gave all of this its weight is no longer there. There is no sound of collapse, no clear marker to signal that something has ended. only a nameless emptiness where meaning once existed but is no longer felt. Power is still everywhere. In sacred images, in familiar structures, in rituals repeated with regularity. But people no longer see why these things are necessary. Order still demands obedience, yet it no longer brings the feeling that it protects them or truly represents their lives. Compliance becomes mechanical, sustained by habit and inertia rather than by inner consent. From the center, nothing seems to have changed. The machinery still runs, titles are still passed on, rituals preserve their forms. From that vantage point, the empire still exists. But at the level of lived experience, what mattered most is gone. Old stories are no longer told with the same feeling. Symbols that once offered reassurance now register only as familiar images, no longer strong enough to evoke a sense of belonging. The withdrawal of meaning causes no shock because it unfolds slowly. Each generation feels only a small portion of the shift. People continue to live within the same framework, yet their attachment grows faint. Order is no longer seen as self-evidently right, but as something that has existed for a long time and continues simply because nothing else has taken its place. The paradox is that as the core weakens, form is often emphasized even more. Rituals may grow more elaborate, symbols more carefully preserved, as though attention alone could hold on to what is slipping away, but form cannot generate meaning on its own. When the distance between symbol and lived experience grows too wide, repetition only exposes the emptiness beneath. People go on with their lives, they work, raise children, bury the dead according to familiar rites. Yet they no longer live with the sense that they are participating in a shared order that gives these acts meaning. In daily experience, the empire is no longer a living presence, but a familiar backdrop, visible, enduring, yet uninvolved. In this state, the empire has not vanished, but it is no longer itself. Once the inner support of meaning has withdrawn, everything that remains is left to time. Not the time of a great event or a decisive battle, but the time it takes for forms sustained by inertia to lose the ability to hold themselves together. And in that quiet passage, when meaning no longer upholds order from within, society enters a fragile condition, one in which existence continues, but the feeling of belonging does not. A shared system that no longer generates meaning is rarely abandoned all at once. Life continues within familiar frameworks, old rhythms are maintained, but attachment has shifted. The empire is no longer seen as an extension of life itself, but as an external condition that must simply be endured. There is no open resistance, no clear confrontation, only a gradual retreat into smaller spaces where people still feel able to understand and manage things on their own. Life goes on, but the sphere of concern narrows. Family, village, and close relationships become central. What is tied to shared authority feels distant, less relevant to daily choice. When taxes are collected, people pay out of obligation. When rituals are performed, they participate out of habit. The actions remain, but the feeling has withdrawn. It is this quiet indifference that weakens order more effectively than any external threat. An empire can confront conflict as long as people still feel there is something worth protecting. But when the sense of belonging disappears, power loses the natural energy that once sustained it. People are no longer willing to sacrifice or actively preserve what they no longer see as their own. On the surface, society still appears stable. There are no major crises, no obvious signs of disintegration. It is precisely this calm that makes indifference dangerous. It allows order to persist in a prolonged, weakened state, encouraging the center to believe everything remains under control. Yet beneath the surface, the bond between people and empire has thinned to the point where even a minor shock could cause it to break. People continue living, but they no longer tell the story of the empire as their own. Shared memories fade, replaced by personal concerns. When power requires spontaneous support, it no longer receives it. Commands may still be carried out, but spirit and commitment are absent. This indifference does not arise from a clear political stance. It is a deeply human response to an order that no longer listens or protects. When belief is gone, people do not necessarily resist. They simply stop caring. And when a society reaches that point, an empire may still exist in name, but its capacity to recover has been severely diminished. From here, order becomes vulnerable to forces from outside. Not because those forces are stronger, but because the inner foundation is no longer resilient enough to absorb disruption. When external pressures arrive, they do not shatter a solid structure. They step into a space that has already been hollowed out, where indifference has quietly left the door open to changes the empire no longer has the strength to contain. A change in power usually brings new names, new symbols, and new faces at the center. Life, however, does not operate on that level. For most people, a change of ruler does not mean the familiar world is erased. What is tied to survival, labor, habit, and ways of thinking continues, often with little disruption. New orders rarely begin from nothing. They take over what already exists because that is the least costly way to govern a society. Systems of taxation, land management, labor organization, even rituals are preserved or only lightly adjusted. This is not done out of respect for the past, but because these structures have already proven that they function in lived reality. People in such moments adapt more quickly than is often assumed, not because they are easily changed, but because they are accustomed to living within frameworks they did not choose. When the old order has already lost its meaning, the arrival of a new one does not produce a deep psychological shock. People adjust the names they use, learn new conventions, and continue living according to very old needs. What is striking is how many core elements of society persist through changes in power. The organization of community life, ideas of order, administrative habits, and even familiar symbols embedded in daily experience do not vanish simply because a new name appears at the center. They have taken root deeply enough to endure even when they are no longer attached to the original empire. Over time, new layers of authority settle over older ones. Each layer brings its own adjustments, but rarely erases what came before. Life unfolds as a process of accumulation, where the past does not disappear but recedes, quietly shaping how society responds to the present. People may no longer speak of Egypt as they once did, yet they continue to live within patterns of thought and organization formed long ago. For this reason, the end of an empire does not mean the end of its influence. What lasts longest is not political power, but the ways people have learned to organize life, interpret the world, and accept order. These are difficult to replace quickly because they do not exist as commands, but as deeply ingrained habits. Seen from sufficient distance, what remains is not a list of dynasties or the name of the last ruler. What endures are traces of a way of thinking once strong enough to shape the lives of millions over a very long span of time. It is these traces, rather than military victories or defeats, that prove most durable, moving quietly through successive changes of rule and gradually becoming part of a shared memory, even after the name of the empire itself is no longer spoken as a living reality. When power changes hands, the first shifts usually appear at the level of symbols. New names enter decrees, the language of rule is altered, signs of authority are rearranged. But the lives of most people do not pause to wait for those changes to settle. Fields still need to be worked. The river continues its familiar rise and fall. People still worry about food, about labor, about burying their dead. Beneath the change of rulers, life keeps moving along a momentum formed long ago. New rulers rarely erase everything they inherit. They retain the old apparatus, relying on those who already know how to measure land, keep records, collect taxes, and organize labor. Too much disruption creates instability, and instability offers no advantage to a power that needs to secure itself quickly. What happens instead is selective inheritance. The surface may change, but the deeper structure remains familiar because it has already proven that it can function in real, everyday life. For ordinary people, changes at the center often feel distant. Who stands at the top does not determine whether they survive the dry season. What matters is whether the new order continues to guarantee the basics of life. When granaries still open on time, when obligations do not rise abruptly, when the rhythm of daily life is not violently broken, new power is accepted passively. Not through attachment, but through adaptation. In this context, Egypt no longer governs itself in the old way, but it does not disappear from lived experience either. It is absorbed into larger structures called by different names over time. Beneath new layers of authority, old habits persist. People continue to rely on the rhythms of nature, continue familiar rituals within families and local communities, even as the meanings attached to them gradually change. What endures is not the name of the order, but a way of living that has taken deep root. This continuity reveals something essential. When an empire loses its central role, society does not immediately fall apart. Life does not wait for fully formed grand narratives to continue. It adapts to whatever framework is imposed, as long as that framework does not completely destroy familiar foundations. Basic human needs force new rulers to compromise with local realities, regardless of where they come from or what they bring with them. Over time, new elements slowly seep into daily life. Language shifts. New symbols appear. Priorities are rearranged, but these changes arrive in layers, settling over older ones rather than erasing them. The result is a space of overlap where the old no longer dominates but does not vanish either, remaining quietly beneath the surface of the present. As life grows accustomed to this layering, the image of the old empire recedes into the background of culture. It no longer exists as a force that commands, but as a sediment within how society is organized, how people understand power, and how they accept being governed. People no longer live for the empire, they live within new structures that surround them. And this quiet continuity leads to a different question, no longer about who holds power, but about what remains after many changes of name and rule, the elements durable enough to outlast shifting authority and continue shaping life long after an empire has ceased to occupy the center. The names once bound to power are no longer spoken every day, yet certain underlying layers remain. They do not exist as entities that can be pointed to on a map, nor do they demand loyalty. Instead, they take root quietly in how people think and act. Formed over long stretches of time, these layers no longer need protection because they have become habit. The way society is organized is one such layer, measuring land, recording obligations, distributing resources, coordinating labor. None of these are reinvented each time power changes hands. Methods that have proven effective continue to be used because they keep life from sliding into chaos. New rulers may adjust priorities, but they rarely dismantle the entire system that already works. It is this continuity that allows many structures to survive beyond the realm of politics. Symbols, too, do not disappear when power fades. Their meanings shift, interpretations change, but familiar forms remain. A space once considered sacred may be linked to a different story, yet the sense of order it evokes continues to function. The strength of a symbol lies not in its original message, but in its ability to suggest that the world has structure, depth, and is not purely accidental. The most enduring layer exists in cultural memory. It does not need to be fully written down to survive. It lives in stories passed through families, in rituals repeated over generations, in instinctive responses to changes in nature and daily life. These memories may be imprecise in detail, but they carry a sense of continuity, the feeling that the present is an extension of something much older. What remains no longer serves a specific empire, it serves everyday life. These remnants help people adapt to new orders without starting from nothing, allowing society to continue even as outward forms change. Because of this, the collapse of power does not necessarily mean the collapse of life itself. What is striking is how rarely these traces are noticed while they are at work. For those living within them, they are simply how things are done. No one thinks of themselves as carrying the legacy of a vanished order. They use what is familiar and practical because that is the easiest way to keep going. And it is in this unintentional continuity that the past finds a way to exist within the present, not as a force that commands, but as a quiet foundation, shaping how society is organized and how the world is understood. When everything else has changed, these underlying layers still support life, blurring the line between what has disappeared and what remains. From this, a thought slowly emerges. Perhaps the durability of a society does not lie in how long it endures under a single name, but in whether what it creates can continue to live on, even after the form that gave birth to it is gone. Egypt no longer exists as a functioning system, yet it has not vanished from human life. It has shifted into another mode of existence, quieter, no longer tied to command or power, but living on within humanity's shared memory. From the position of a ruling entity, Egypt has gradually become an image seen from great distance, where concrete details fade while broad outlines grow sharper than ever. In the way people remember Egypt, the complexities of everyday life no longer occupy the center. Small disputes, the slow adjustments of administration, the fatigue that accumulated over time are rarely recalled. In their place stand condensed images, massive stones resting in the desert, sacred symbols linked to cosmic order, the sense that there once existed a society able to organize life with a vision extending far beyond a single human lifespan. This narrowing is not a deliberate embellishment, it is simply how human memory works. When a civilization is no longer part of lived experience, it is compressed into symbol. Egypt, in this way, becomes an image of endurance, of an ancient order that seems untouched by time. Those who look toward it no longer seek practical answers for daily life. They seek something broader, the reassurance that human beings have, at least once, built structures strong enough to outlast their creators. At the symbolic level, Egypt no longer belongs only to those who once lived along the Nile. It becomes a shared anchor for the imagination of many different eras. Each period looks at it and reads what aligns with its own concerns. Some see stability. Others see grandeur, others see a reminder that every order, no matter how solid it appears, is subject to change. The symbol is wide enough to contain all of these interpretations, and that openness is precisely why it endures. When Egypt exists as symbol, it is no longer bound tightly to historical precision. The stories retold do not need to reflect every detail of the past, they reflect the needs of the present. A symbol is not meant to reconstruct life as it once was, but to enter into dialogue with the questions people continue to carry. Through that dialogue, Egypt remains meaningful, even though that meaning has drifted far from how those who once lived within its order understood themselves. This transformation from empire to symbol reveals something essential. Power may dissolve, but images and ideas can persist for a very long time if they touch deep human concerns. In human memory, Egypt is no longer a specific geographic space. It becomes a way of thinking about time, about durability, and about the desire to leave traces that extend beyond a finite human life. A civilization preserved in this way is not remembered only for what it once was. The story turns outward again, back toward the present. Why do people, across different places and different moments, keep feeling compelled to build large structures that encompass their lives? What is it in these symbols that draws us back again and again, urging us to question, despite knowing that beneath the appearance of permanence lies a reality that is fragile, ordinary, and always subject to time? Looking back across the entire arc, the focus is not on how an empire collapses, but on why human beings across different places and different eras continue to build such vast systems in the first place. Each time they confront the unpredictability of nature, society, or life itself, people try to gather the world into a shape that can be understood and partially controlled, even while knowing that no shape lasts forever. It may be that the impulse to build empires grows from the fragility of individual life. A single human lifetime is too brief to feel enduring, so people turn toward structures that extend beyond themselves. When placed within a larger order, personal existence seems to stretch further, not through the body but through the feeling of belonging to an ongoing continuum. Yet is this the primary motive, or only one layer among many stacked together over time? It may also arise from a very practical need for stability. When environments and social relations become too uncertain, people need shared frameworks to divide responsibility, coordinate resources, and reduce risk. Large systems make the future feel less opaque. But if stability is the goal, why do those same systems so often grow rigid over time, until they themselves begin to generate new forms of instability? Another perspective suggests that empires are born from collective imagination. People tell one another stories about order, purpose, and continuity, and gradually begin to live as if those stories were reality. When enough people believe in the same story, it becomes the foundation of shared life. But when the story no longer resonates with lived experience, the order built upon it starts to lose its ability to support society. What then allows a story to sustain belief across generations before it begins to fade? Looked at more deeply, perhaps large orders are not created only to organize society, but to answer questions of meaning. When confronted with the limits of their own lives, people seek structures that appear timeless. Symbols, rituals, and shared frameworks offer the feeling that individual life belongs to something larger. Yet that feeling does not last indefinitely. When it no longer reflects lived reality, a sense of absence emerges once again. There is no single explanation for why humans continually build large orders. Each society carries its own reasons, intertwined and reshaped by circumstance. What can be recognized, however, is that this impulse reflects something deeply human, the search for order, for meaning, and for continuity in a world that is always in motion. This idea is not meant to close the story, but to widen it. Another question quietly takes shape. If building vast structures is a familiar response to uncertainty, what happens when those very structures become new sources of uncertainty themselves? When old stories no longer sustain life, what will people turn toward? Or will they simply create new forms under new names, still carrying the same enduring need? Looking back across the entire flow, what emerges is not a dark conclusion, but a simple truth. Every system, no matter how carefully built, no matter how deeply it once provided stability and meaning, contains fragility within it. This fragility does not come from a lack of human wisdom, but from the fact that the world has never remained still long enough for any structure to hold its shape forever. That fragility does not mean failure. It is simply the consequence of order being created to serve human life, while human life itself is always changing. When circumstances shift, what once made sense can begin to feel confining. When needs evolve, old frameworks may no longer be flexible enough. This does not erase the value of the original order. It places it within the context of the moment that gave birth to it. No order collapses because of a single blow. It grows tired. It responds more slowly to small changes. It continues to operate by inertia, until the misalignment accumulates to a point that can no longer be ignored. Most of the time, people do not notice this process because they live inside familiarity. That very familiarity hides the earliest signs of change. Yet it is precisely because order is not immutable that it can endure for as long as it does. A completely rigid system would shatter at the first major disruption. The orders that last are those that can adapt for a long time, until they can no longer do so. When they stop meeting the needs of life, change is not a rejection of the past, but the inevitable movement of time. Put plainly, every order is temporary. This does not make the effort of building meaningless. On the contrary, it reminds us that the value of an order lies not in how long it lasts, but in what it offers to the people who live within it during its time. There are periods when order provides safety, stability, and a sense of meaning. Those experiences do not vanish simply because the order itself eventually fades. Seeing history this way softens judgment. Instead of asking why an order failed to last forever, perhaps it is better to ask how it allowed people to live, for how long, and at what cost. Every system is a temporary balance between needs, resources, and belief. When that balance no longer fits, change becomes unavoidable. Recognizing the fragility of all orders does not require people to stop organizing their world. It simply reminds us that no form is a final destination. Within that understanding, there is a certain calm. People continue to build, to adjust, and sometimes to let go, not out of despair, but out of an acceptance that this, too, is part of living in a world that is always in motion. Seen this way, history is no longer a chain of collapses, but a long process of learning how to live with change. Systems rise and recede, while life itself continues to flow, carrying forward what still fits and leaving behind what has been exhausted. In this current, people keep searching for new ways to create stability, even knowing that stability can exist only for a limited time. And within this quiet continuation, the most familiar image is not of monuments or power, but of water still moving forward, never turning back no matter what shapes have been imposed upon it. No matter how many times forms of order have changed, there remains a reality that continues on its own rhythm, one that does not need to be defended, believed in, or remembered. The Nile still flows. It flows through successive dynasties, through names once exalted and later forgotten, through symbols once thought immutable. The waters still rise and recede, carrying silt that nourishes life while washing away the traces humans once tried to preserve as proof of their presence. Human beings change how they organize society, how they name power, how they tell the story of their own past. But their fundamental needs remain the same. They still require stability in order to go on living, still need some framework to lean on, still seek the reassurance that tomorrow will not be entirely alien to today. These needs do not arise from empires or ideologies, but from the immediate experience of existing in a world that is always edged with risk. The river, in this sense, becomes a neutral anchor. It takes no side. It neither supports nor resists any form of power, yet it compels adjustment. When the water rises, people must wait. When it retreats, they must act. These cycles remind us that there are rhythms beyond human control, and that any order can endure only if it learns to align itself with deeper currents, rather than trying to deny them. People have built vast structures to lessen uncertainty, to make the world more intelligible, but in the end, they still live within familiar limits. They must eat, work, raise children, and face death. These realities do not change when the name of power changes. And so when one order collapses, people do not collapse with it. They adapt their ways of living, accept new frameworks, and continue searching for other forms capable of meeting needs that have existed for a very long time. The river keeps flowing past communities that have forgotten the names of those once considered the center of the world. It passes fields that have been divided and redivided, rituals whose meanings have shifted, generations unaware that they stand atop layers of accumulated pasts. Yet the water still arrives when it is needed, and it is this regularity that allows life to continue regardless of which grand story is being told. In this image, there is neither glorification of the past nor denial of the present. There is only a simple truth. Humans change how they organize the world, but they keep searching for the same things: security, meaning, and continuity. The river offers no answers to these pursuits, but it sets the limits within which they can unfold. And perhaps it is in this unbroken continuation, requiring no explanation, that we come to see history not as a series of isolated events, but as a long current. Within that current, people endlessly experiment with different ways of living together. The river flows on, not because it knows what is right, but because it does not need to know. And humans, standing on its banks, keep changing, keep organizing, and keep placing their faith in new orders, carrying very old needs with them, as if history were not something taught, but a whisper repeated over and over again, waiting to be heard in a different way. History rarely stands before us and tells us plainly what to do. It does not lecture. It does not warn in a decisive voice. It does not offer conclusions that are easy to remember. Most of the time, history speaks very softly through what has already happened and leaves it to those who come later to decide whether to listen or not. What are often called the lessons of history only become clear when seen from far enough away. While living inside a system, it is difficult to tell stability from stagnation, strength from inertia. History does not intervene at that moment. It does not pull people back when they believe everything will continue as it is. It simply records quietly the choices repeated over time. The whisper of history lives in small details, in how a system that was once flexible slowly becomes rigid, in how trust thins without causing obvious disruption, in how people grow accustomed to weakening long before they give it heavier names. There is no clear boundary where one can say, from here on everything is different. There are only very gradual changes, slow enough that most of those living through them do not realize they are passing through them at all. History does not teach because teaching implies there is only one correct path. Human life rarely moves in such straight lines. What once served as a reasonable solution in one context can become a burden in another. History does not judge this. It simply shows that every choice carries consequences, and that those consequences often arrive much later than the moment the choice was made. Those who hear history's whisper are usually not searching for ready-made formulas. They are people willing to live with ambiguity, who accept that no system lasts forever, and that every order must be reconsidered when circumstances change. Listening to history does not mean repeating the past or trying to avoid it. It means recognizing familiar rhythms within situations that appear entirely new. Those who learn from history do not necessarily avoid all mistakes, but they may notice sooner when a system begins to tire, when trust is being replaced by habit, when form slowly overtakes substance. That awareness does not guarantee success, but it creates space for adjustment before inertia becomes too strong to shift. History speaks softly because it does not compel. It leaves room for people to think, to compare, to question. Within that space, each generation hears different echoes from the same sequence of events. Some sense a warning, some find reassurance. Others hear only the distant reverberation of what has passed. And perhaps it is precisely because history does not instruct but only whispers that learning from it has never been guaranteed. It depends on the willingness to listen and on the ability to accept that what exists now is as fragile as what existed before. When people pause long enough to listen, history does not offer complete answers. Instead, it brings them into a different state of awareness, one where understanding comes not from conclusions, but from attentiveness to a current that continues to flow, slowly, beyond every story humanity tells about itself. After everything that has passed, there is little left that needs to be said. Stories, structures, and people appear, then recede, leaving behind not emptiness, but a settling, like standing for a long time before a vast open space, until the need to analyze or to name things fades, and only a quiet presence remains. This line of reflection does not lead to a clear conclusion. It comes to rest without closing itself, where every pause could still become the beginning of another thought. What once existed does not need to be judged, nor does it ask for praise or regret. It was an answer to real needs under very specific conditions. When those conditions changed, the answers quietly stepped away from the center. What remains in the end is not empire, not power, not the names once carved deeply into memory. What remains is life continuing to move, people being born, living, and finding ways to arrange the world around them so that it feels less unpredictable. Everything that is built, whether large or small, carries a familiar wish to live within a framework that can be endured. What is worth keeping is not the shape of the structures that once existed, but the understanding that all structures are temporary. That understanding does not stop people from organizing their world. It simply leads them to do so with more listening, more caution, and fewer illusions. Not to avoid endings, but to accept that endings are woven into the nature of everything that is made. This story settles without closing any doors. It leaves behind a quiet space where the listener can remain with their own thoughts. There is no need to rush toward conclusions, no need to reduce the past and the present into easy comparisons. It is enough to recognize that what once happened still leaves an echo, not as a loud reminder, but as a slow, steady breath. Within that breath, people continue to walk forward. They carry questions without clear answers. They carry the need for stability and meaning, even while knowing that every form will eventually change. The story does not end here. It only pauses for a moment, long enough to settle, before the familiar current of life continues to flow without needing to assert itself, without needing explanation, simply continuing.